how many of you guys feel like some of our school rules are just unreasonable and unfair? Well, I can assure you that while we may not always like the rules set in place for us here at Southside, we have it much better than other public schools. Before I started this project, I wasn't exactly sure what the school to prison pipeline was. I had heard of it and empathized with those who've experienced it, but never really took the time to understand it. So just to give a sort of overview, the majority of this presentation will consist of what the school to prison pipeline is, or like what defines the school to prison pipeline, what some contributing acts, policies, and factors have been, and the pipeline's cultural influences. The school to prison pipeline is widely referred to as the use of educational policies and practices that have the effect of pushing students, especially students of color and students with disabilities, out of school and toward the juvenile and criminal justice systems. Although there is less data available, students with disabilities, especially those with emotional and behavioral disorders, appear to be suspended or expelled at rates disproportionate to their representation in the population. On the board, you see the definition from the American Civil Liberties Union, which I included because of the term language, because I think it sort of illustrates how these kids are being guided out of these schools. The primary indicators of incarceration have been proven to include race, poverty, and educational attainment. The said incarceration can either be impacted by or impact the primary causes of the school to prison pipeline, which are failing public schools, disincentives to graduate, disciplinary and alternative schools, in-school policing, exclusionary discipline, court involvement, and juvenile detention. There have been a number of educational practices and policies put into place that have the effect of indirectly assisting the funneling out of these students, some of which can be seen when we talk about a few contributing acts and policies. So some contributing acts include the No Child Left Behind Act and the Read to Succeed Act, while a contributing policy is the Zero Tolerance policy, and a large contributing factor is poverty. The pipeline underwent trying changes as a result of each of these, regardless of their intended purpose. The first contributing act mentioned is the No Child Left Behind Act. This act was designed to hold schools accountable for student performance while also accurately and correctly analyzing differentials in outcomes by race, socioeconomic status, disability, and English language proficiency. It was also one of the 8 revisions of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act as a part of the Great Society proposed by President Johnson in 1965. As a revised version of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, the No Child Left Behind Act focused heavily on standardized testing as a standard for accountability with uncompromising consequences to the results of these tests. As a result of the instructions and mandates to raise students' test scores, districts, schools, administrators, and teachers are under great pressure to generate results. So in order for the No Child Left Behind Act to ensure the achievement of its purposes, it had 4 key pillars: accountability, flexibility, methodology, and choice. The 2 pillars that I want to focus on are the accountability and choice pillar. The accountability pillar required that schools and districts produce annual report cards showing the students' improvement on standardized tests for every school year. Schools that don't make progress were required to provide supplemental services such as tutoring or after-school care assistance, take corrective actions, and if they aren't making adequate progress each year, then they must make substantial changes to the way that the school is directed. The choice pillar allows parents to choose better performing schools as long as transportation is provided. Choice has led to the idea of a tale of 2 schools, which refers to factors and circumstances that lead to differences in performance of learners from different educational settings. For example, private and charter schools are provided with more resources to better prepare students for professional development after graduation than low-income schools are. Students who are surrounded by poverty in their community are less likely to be empowered to influence the course of their education due to their inability to change the overall situation in their setting. The differences in the learning environments can reflect the overall economic disparities and illustrate how students are presented with drastically different opportunities. Overall, the original goal of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act was to close the gap of the reading, writing, and mathematics between children in low-income schools and children in low-off schools. However, the No Child Left Behind Act neglected to fulfill that purpose. As a result of the emphasis on standardized testing, students appear to be seen as statistics on test scores rather than a priority. The Read to Succeed Act was passed in 2014 and was designed to make sure that every child can read by the time they advance past the 3rd grade. Most of us would probably hear this and think that being able to read by the time you leave the 3rd grade shouldn't really be a concern. However, it's a large concern because this is an obstacle seen in more schools than you may think, and in local schools, for example, Fountain Elementary. Many students from disadvantaged backgrounds are not able to read at the third grade level. Therefore, in efforts of trying to accurately adhere to the Act, some problems can emerge while also trying to help the students achieve the standard level of reading. These problems could be that some students may not have a strong support system, so before or after school tutoring may not be an option because they wouldn't have a way of transportation. Without the option of tutoring outside of class, teachers would have to sacrifice class time in order to help, and they'd risk getting behind on other core subjects. And schools simply may not have the funds to provide the help that's needed. A contributing policy is the zero tolerance policy. It refers to the shift of adopting very harsh disciplinary codes covering a wide range of student misbehavior. These behaviors can vary from truancy and vulgar language to drug and weapon possession. Policies that were commonly labeled zero tolerance have historically included and currently include offenses such as drugs or gun possession and understandably offered no consideration for mitigating circumstances. However, most students do not get suspended for being gun or drug offenders, but instead get suspended for nonviolent violations of school codes. Many times, the out-of-school suspension or expulsion can lead to a more permanent withdrawal from education. Studies show that students who are suspended for longer periods of time tend to drop out of school more than those who are suspended for shorter periods of time. The students who drop out are presented with more free time and fewer peer relationships, which can increase the likelihood that they will commit crime in the future. However, schools unfortunately rely on the funding of adhering to this policy in order to provide their students with the resources needed to succeed academically. Poverty is associated with many adverse conditions and can affect school choice because it's a powerful predictor of graduation rates due to families of low income having to redirect their priorities. Disadvantaged communities influence youth development with the lack of resources available, such as playgrounds and parks or after-school programs, and negative exposures, such as peer and environmental influences. For example, students living in poor communities are more likely to have dropouts as friends, which increases the likelihood of dropping out of school. Inequitable education opportunities continue to be on the rise for students from disadvantaged communities. So briefly, I want to talk about something that's referred to as the preschool to prison pipeline. The school to prison pipeline can impact children as early as ages 4 and 5 by surprisingly having suspensions and expulsions as disciplinary practices. In terms of preschool, the likelihood of suspension or expulsion are greatest based on the predictors of size, race, and gender. The 3 Bs refers to those who are most likely to be suspended or expelled. These children are larger than their peers, Black, and boys. After Black boys, Black girls are most likely to get suspended or expelled. The Institute for Child Success states that this likelihood is a result of them receiving harsher discipline because they are viewed as more adult-like and in less need of nurturing, protection, and support. This viewpoint puts Black girls at risk for the school to prison pipeline simply based on their appearance, just as it does for Black boys. An unwelcoming educational environment, especially towards a child this young, makes the likelihood of eventual incarceration much greater. So when it comes to out-of-school suspensions, some statistics from the 2015 to 2016 school year state that 2.7 million K-12 students received 1 or more out-of-school suspensions. On the graph, the percentage that's on the circle shows how much of each gender and race made up the 2.7 million. The main thing that I want to point out is that out of these 2.7 million, only 8% of the male students were Black, but represented 25% of the out-of-school suspensions. And 25% of the males of the students were white, but represented 24%. While both races seem to be close in the rates of the out-of-school suspensions, there's a great disproportionality in the percentage of representation of the 2 races. So why should Christians care about a problem like this? Disciplinary actions resulting in suspensions and expulsions increase the risk of dropping out of school and the likelihood of being imprisoned. As studies have shown, non-white students are imprisoned at a higher rate than white students, which impacts getting a job, credit score, and obtaining government or public assistance. Students who are unable to complete high school earn less income, which continues to drive poverty. These students are part of a generation that is quite literally our future. So the more students that drop out of school and choose not to further their education or are incarcerated, the more society is at a disadvantage. Because these individuals are less likely to become productive citizens and more likely to depend on the tax dollars of the working families. So here are a few verses from the Bible, and they all provide a blueprint as to how Christians should act in situations such as discipline within schools. Matthew 18:22 reminds us that we are to forgive each other because everyone is guilty of sin. Therefore, the zero tolerance policy in schools contrasts the verse because it condemns children without offering them a second chance. The policy does not demonstrate forgiveness to students who make mistakes, but instead sends them away for their wrongdoings. Furthermore, Romans 3:24-25 states how those who believe are redeemed in Christ. The redemption is significant because it shows how forgiving God is and the self-sacrifice that Jesus made for those who not only sinned, but even sinned against him. If God is able to pass over former sins, then people should be able to pass over their neighbor's sins as best as they possibly can. The Bible states in 1 John 5:16-17 that each and every sin is wrong, but certain sins lead straight to a fate of condemnation. Petty offenses made in underprivileged schools are unlikely to lead to death and would suffice with simple discipline, forgiveness, and reinforcement. Therefore, the zero tolerance policy in the school-to-prison pipeline should not punish students who commit petty offenses by potentially giving them a criminal record. The criminal record could be seen as the death of that student's academic career, professional career, or even literal death of the student's life due to the cycle that their newly earned criminal record would insert them into. Educators should be trained to understand the underlying causes of students with behavioral issues. They should also be trained to identify their own cultural biases. Restorative practices could be implemented if resources were provided to help students, creating a supportive school environment. Investing in a student's overall well-being can ultimately lead to an independent and productive citizen.
All right, very well done, Krystin. So we have several guests with us. I wanted to open it up to you. If you have any questions or feedback for Krystin, please feel free to offer that.
I have a question. What do you think should happen with that 12-year-old kid who shot and killed the young man in middle school here in Greenville?
I definitely think he should be punished. I don't know exactly what I think should happen, but I think the zero tolerance policy should, I agree with any type of, a juvenile detention would be fine. I felt like in that circumstance.
The deputy who was here at school the next day, I asked him what was going to happen. Mm-hmm. He's 12. He said he'd be held in the juvenile detention center in Greenville until he was 18 and then tried as an adult. Do you think he should be tried as an adult? How can a 12-year-old really, yes, what he did was horribly wrong, but you're locking somebody up for that horrific mistake. Is there some way that we can rehabilitate him or get mental health issues or something like that?
I'm not exactly sure what the answer is to that, but I don't agree that he should be tried as an adult. I think that he should spend a few years in the juvenile detention to kind of have a punishment for what he did, but I feel like 18, from 12 to 18, that's a long time, and I feel like he could grow a lot during those years.
So do you think we should be spending more money on mental health services and community counseling? Some people think we ought to empty out the offenders in prisons that are low-level offenders.
I do think that community counseling would be a great investment, especially within schools, since a lot of students don't have the transportation to get to those types of institutions. So within schools would be great to have counseling.
That's a good answer.
I have just a couple of things, a couple of clarifications, and then it's probably answer my question. So the zero tolerance policy, right, that most of them are for drugs or guns, right? That makes sense. But you had mentioned the petty offenses. Define what you mean by that, and then that'll go to my next question.
So a petty offense would be getting into a fight at school, like a very small fight, I guess. One example is, this is very rare, but one example is that a girl, she had a knife packed into her lunchbox. Her mom packed it in her lunchbox so that she could cut her apple. She took the knife to the teacher, and the teacher immediately she got her suspended. Even though she had no intention of doing anything wrong with the knife, it was just the fact that she had a weapon on campus. So, stuff like that.
Okay. All right. So, yes, I just wanted that clarification. So then my next question, because you had mentioned it, but I'd just like to hear a little bit more about it. So, for those things, if we don't do suspensions, it's probably a little rough. What are some alternatives to that? That's what I wanted you to discuss a little bit more.
Like a detention, or after school detention, lunch detention, kind of, something for them to know that what they did is wrong or it should not be done again, but not something so extreme that they're out of school for a certain period of time so then they'll have more exposure to like their environment. Because most of these students are in negative environments, so if they're out of school, then they're getting exposed to things that they normally wouldn't be if they were in school during those hours.
Mm-hmm. And I would agree with that. So the question is, and this is probably more of just a thought, so detentions, right, a lunch detention or whatever, are those really effective? In other words, do they really show a consequence, or?
I think that really depends on the student, honestly, and their mindset. Some students, once they get in trouble, they don't want it to happen again. Some students simply just don't care. So you can't really change their mindset and how they feel about that type of stuff.
So I think mindset is a key, which is what
Yes, absolutely.
So do you think that it could happen? That's what I'm really asking. So instead of maybe doing a detention or something like that, maybe have a program of a counselor to actually talk with them and go through it, because you can help change the mindset. It ultimately has to be the student, but you can help it. Perhaps that is an alternative. Do you think that could happen? Like how?
I'm not 100% sure. I guess we just have to figure out a way to get counselors into schools who actually want to be there and actually want to help.
Yes. Thank you.
Any other question?
Statement first. Fantastic presentations. One more professionally done presentations that I've seen. Just a couple, probably sort of clarification questions like Dr. Reamer was asking. You said the private and charter schools are provided more resources than schools in low economic areas, or I can't remember exactly the rest of the quote. They are? Two, by whom?
I think they're provided with more resources to prepare them for life after graduation.
Okay.
Not necessarily more resources like teaching resources, I guess, but like I feel like I'm better prepared here. Like my brother went to Brazier, and his mindset, he didn't do great in Brazier because of their system. Mm-hmm. And compared to here, I feel like I've been better prepared than he has with.
But you don't mean like they're given more.
No.
Educational resources in the classroom or something like that. Okay. Because that was my question with regards to tax dollars and stuff like that. Because then you also talk about the relying on funding from adherence to the zero tolerance policy, which I thought was fascinating. That in order to get, presumably that's funding from the state, you have to adhere to a zero tolerance policy.
Yeah.
That is interesting to me. Why are race, poverty, and educational attainment three key factors in the school to prison pipeline?
Well, race, because I guess people's like presuppositions, like what they automatically think of a student when they walk in, just based off how they look and how they treat that student. So certain students get better treatment than others, which could lead to a huge impact in how they retain information and how they take the information that's taught to them. And then poverty, just because their environmental influences, like I was telling Dr. Reamer, a lot of these students don't have a support system at home that's reinforcing this value of education.
So there's kind of this standard line that maybe you found in the research of this. There's this standard line that's like, well, if you don't want to be poor, there's really three key ways to avoid being poor. Stay out of jail, graduate high school, don't have a baby before you're 18. Which statistically bears out, but does not pay attention to the factors as to why someone might go to jail, or drop out of school, or have a child before they're 18. So like, just the standard, like, hey, here's the antidote to all of your problems about poverty or something like that. Like, you do a better job here of explaining. I think maybe you could do a better job here of explaining like why those three factors are, shall we say, historical. But no, good. I think I'm good for now. Thank you.
I would echo Mr. Moore's sentiment that it was a fantastic presentation, Krystin. Helpful for me as a listener. I had one question, and I wasn't sure if I just misunderstood. What prevents schools from just like cutting bait? Like, if a student is acting poorly, and from what I understand, like a lot of schools in the Chicagoland area, I have friends that work in the Chicago public school systems and work in predominantly Hispanic and Black communities, that they get their funding usually by the amount of students that graduate, like percentage-wise, and the amount of students who not just graduate but also go to college, but also not just go to any college, but go to a four-year university. And so they only receive higher funds from the state if they meet those kind of criteria. And like if I was a school system, is there accountability from keeping them from being like, hey, you know, zero tolerance policy, they have to adhere to those policies in order to get money? What would prevent us? Is there accountability for school systems to just not be like, hey, you know, you've been acting up way too much, and it's actually easier for us to just cut bait and say like, you gotta go find somewhere else to go? Is there? Maybe I misunderstood something in that. Do you have a thought on that?
Not 100% sure.
I'm just curious. I have those friends that were telling me that 80%, he's a middle school PE teacher. He said that 80% of his students that he teaches have PTSD, or could be clinically diagnosed with PTSD. And so meeting criteria is like graduating from high school, going to a four-year university, it just seems like, who could do that? And you said also not just students of color, but also students who have personality disorders, right? There's less research on this, but those are compounding issues for students in these communities. And not that Chicago public school system seems to have the glowing record. Unfortunately, these are kind of like self-fulfilling prophecies in a way, which seems to kind of reinforce what you're talking about today. So thank you for shedding further light on the topic.
My turn. So the one thing that particularly stood out interesting to me was like part of this was the prison side of it. So it's preschool. Breaks my heart that like it's from preschool to prison pipeline because of just the imagery that makes you think of. But why does this end at prison as opposed to poverty or homelessness? I know those things are the same, but why does this end at prison? Why does it not just end at they come out of this pipeline and I think you're right, like the funnel, the pipeline, I think when kids get shuffled from one place to another, I think that's a really good way of describing it. Why does it end in prison as opposed to just these folks? And it would be a problem if they were impoverished. Like, please don't hear me say that. I'm curious as why the end result is prison. Why is it a criminal issue? Which again, it's more interest on my part than anything, but could you, and maybe, I know you said a couple of things in your paper that, you know, probably didn't make the cut, and that's understandable for your presentation. Is there something to be said about how behavioral offenses in a public system in this school to prison pipeline, behavioral offenses or violations are treated as criminal issues as opposed to, as opposed to just behavioral issues? Now, exceptions notwithstanding, the 12-year-old kid that shoots somebody, that's a criminal offense. You made, like Dr. Reamer was saying, there's a really important distinction to make between violent offenders and behavioral issues, and so maybe that's part of your reply to this. But why are these things that, as a teacher, I would think are behavioral issues for my students, why are they seen as criminal issues?
I'm not sure that this is like the set in stone answer, but it could just be that some teachers just don't understand like those kids' circumstances and where they come from and what their home life is like, and they may not take that into consideration because they have all of these other students to care for, and it's kind of hard for you to just kind of sit down, look at the student that's acting up and all of these other students that are acting up and be like, okay, well, what's going on at home? How can I help them? Stuff like that.
Yeah, I think there's something to be said about teachers being overwhelmed with it. If I could throw in an anecdote as well, I know one issue that a lot of, because like Pastor Colin was saying, like a lot of these things just compound one another. But you mentioned a lot about the disparity between how much money these schools, and Mr. Moore even mentioned like how much money these schools are receiving, how that translates immediately over to this problem and exasperates the problem, makes the problem worse. We have security. Dr. Sofer mentioned we've been blessed to have folks that are more than willing to come and keep us secure at our school. Most schools want security, but the type of security that you can afford makes a really big difference. And so schools in higher income areas are able to hire security, whether it's a private security firm or whether it's paying police officers to be there, versus schools who can't afford that and therefore need someone from the sheriff's department to basically volunteer of their time and show up. And so it's just, I've heard all sorts of like the one instance with the girl and the knife and all that stuff. I've heard all those types of specific instances where the difference between a security guard helping the principals and administration bring things under control versus a police officer being there trying to bring things under control, those are two very different situations with very different outcomes. If the administration has a hired security guard there bringing things under control, the kid's suspended. If the police officer is the one trying to bring things under control, that kid ends up in handcuffs, right? And it's one of those instances where, yeah, money does make a huge difference because the school can't afford to keep things in-house and handle things as a behavioral disciplinary issue. A school that can't afford that, it immediately becomes a criminal issue. And it's just like we've been saying here, all these things compound on one another and you end up with the pipeline. You end up that these kids don't get like the stuff that Dr. Reamer was talking about, having rather than just sticking them in a room for punishment somewhere, having a counselor or someone actually actively saying, okay, so why does this keep recurring? We need to break this cycle somehow. Anyways, that's my anecdote, and thank you for being patient here. Classmates, I want to open it to you.
I have one more question.
Sure.
And this is simple, Kristen. You brought up at the beginning, why do we have rules here that you think are like ridiculous? What was the point in bringing that out?
Because a lot of our rules, we complain about like dress code and stuff, but that's really nothing in comparison to what these students go through every day.
Logan, go for it.
Whenever like I hear about this issue, it seems like everyone points to like education as a solution, like trying to funnel these kids into college instead of prison. But is that the actual solution, or is it giving them programs, whether they go to school or not, to help them to not end up in
I think it's more I think it's more so the programs, because you can like the education will help, but ultimately helping them through what they're going through psychologically, mentally, at home, and stuff like that, that's going to help them in the long run.
Really good point, Logan.
Yeah, because it just seems like everyone just says, get them to college.
Get them to college and everything's,
And
no,
even if
obviously.
they get to college, like, they're still, like, what they were exposed to as a child, like,
Yeah.
if they're exposed to those same things in college, then that ultimately makes them dropping out of college.
Yeah, it's still cool, like when you're the first generation
Yeah.
of your family to go to school, but it doesn't mean you're going to fix your issue.
Yeah, but then what if you go to Clemson, which is 83% white?
Yeah.
And you're like, oh, okay, cool.
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah. These are a bunch of rich white kids. Cool.
Sydney?
Why did you choose this topic?
Because, okay, so I've seen the impacts or like the outcomes of poverty through my mom and her family. Like her and her siblings, they grew up in poverty. And so she, because of their negative exposure, she got pregnant at a young age with my brother. And her brother dropped out of school when he was in 9th grade. And my mom met some people who helped her through and like exposed her to positive environmental influences and showed her like the value of her education, which helped her to do better in life. But then my uncle didn't have that opportunity. So he's still trying to overcome his circumstances and do better as he's grown and matured, but it's been harder for him. So.
Makes a really big impact just having a crew of people that care enough to intervene, yeah. Anybody else? Mikey?
You talked about mindset earlier. So do you think that we should like try to interact like with the kids more?
100%. Because a lot of these kids don't get one-on-one time, so even just having like 30 minutes of time with someone that's giving them attention.
Thank you.
Michaela?
I don't know if you did like a lot of research on this, but like I'd say like a lot of like kids like they start with, you know, smaller things and like with how teachers like treat that, I guess. Do you think more training should be done for teachers to like treat like them better? Because you know, like certain students might do the exact same thing, completely two different like treats and you know like treatments. And so like when other students see how like that student's treatment versus this student, clearly the student can feel way worse about themselves and do much more. So and that's more like a personal problem like amongst each individual teacher. Like that's kind of hard to combat, but do you think like more like training for teachers could help that?
I do think the training would help because then they're held accountable for their actions, and it's not just, okay, well, I haven't been taught that, so how do I know to do that? But if they've been trained to do that, then that's on them, they can get punished for that.
More like, do you think there should be like maybe punishment, not punishment, but like repercussions for teachers who are treating kids like absolutely blatantly worse than others?
Yes, because if not, then I feel like the teacher's probably just going to continue to do it, and the student's going to see that this teacher is just continuing to do this, and it's going to continue to do that.
But the solution can't be then you send the teacher to jail.
Well, yeah,
And you just
not
have a
to
school prison
jail.
pipeline for teachers. So like, it just feels like there's gotta be,
Well,
unfortunately.
they don't
there has
have to go straight to jail, but
Unfortunately, there has to be like a wholesale, talking about mindset changes, there has to be a mindset change among like entire institutions in our country that stop pathologizing and criminalizing like poor behavior or you know something or poverty.
Smith?
I think that like older students should play a part in setting examples for kids growing up like this and that to like how.
so I know that when I was younger, my brother was a huge, like, if I didn't have an older brother, I don't know that I would be the person I am today. So having an older sibling that is a positive influence, that helps a lot. Or even having like a mentor, like someone that, or a tutor even, like would help these kids. Like a positive influence from a tutor, that would help. Like, I guess, and even if you aren't necessarily, like even if you don't live a positive life, at least in front of the child, like, make it to me, I guess.
So like, do you think this could get better? Like,
Great question. I don't know the answer to that.
that's very much true. Well, see, like, when I say that, I mean, like, alright, so, like, you know how we over East Coast. Like, do you think, at least over here, like, eventually, like, it could get better? And, like, do you think there's a difference in, like all of the schooling that's over here compared to, like, what's in the West Coast?
I'm not really sure because most of my research was in South Carolina, but there probably is a difference.
Yeah. Would it be state to state instead of like different education systems?
Unfortunately, South Carolina, what, Mississippi, Alabama, just go back and forth every year between like 49 and 50. Who has the worst schools in the country?
Yeah.
I'm more Alabama, and this may be a helpful question for, like, this is a real issue. Is there anything, and sometimes we do things structurally, like there's things that need to be changed structurally, while simultaneously, like Logan's question is like, is it the programs or is it the money? And sometimes we go like, is it an either or? And unfortunately, that's how we work sometimes, and it's not an either or most of the time. It's probably a both and, right? It's not like, let's just throw money at something, or, you know, we should prioritize families. It's both, correct? So is there something that highly educated students can do to help combat such an issue as this that you've already potentially stated that would just make it very obvious for people?
So I'm just gonna use like Southside as an example, like how we do our J term, how we go to Freedom International to help those students. I feel like we could do something locally for J term, and we could do a tutor, like spend a week at a low income school, help those students or something like that. Really just being there and helping them.
Fantastic idea. Like I just to throw in, there's this really big stigma between a private Christian school like ours versus public schools like all around us. And I've been in a Christian school my entire life. It doesn't have to be that way, but most of the time it is. And a lot of the times it's because the assumption is we don't have the problems that they have. Can I just say false? We have all of those problems. We just have more safety nets that prevent the consequences of those problems. One of the big ways in which I think we can break down a lot of the stigma, and consequently also love our neighbor as we're supposed to love them, is being able to take the opportunities that we've been afforded and maybe try to expose some other folks to those opportunities. Y'all have had some great educators who have taught you a lot of really great things. So maybe before y'all go off to college and start your adult life, find some kids that haven't had such great teachers or haven't had the opportunities afforded you, and maybe you as a student is one of these people that can push someone in just slightly a more positive direction in life. The personal element here is unavoidable. The fact that a person who cares about you makes all the difference in the world. So yeah, the conversation about systems and programs is a very important conversation. But in the meantime, love your neighbor as yourself, meaning those of you that got really high GPAs, cool. Why don't you go help some of those who don't? Sorry. Big amen on that one. All right, anything else?
Yeah.
TJ?
Yeah. So I just thought about what you just said.
Mm-hmm.
And basically, like kind of like how Dr. Emer and Krystin both said, like, don't you think it's more of a mindset thing, though?
Absolutely.
I don't think the GPA part of that is gonna just give you
No, but don't mishear me. Like someone with a higher GPA by default.
No, I get what you're saying. No, I understand what you're saying. I'm just saying, like say for instance, like you know how you said like go out and like because we got things better here or whatever, like go out and like try to help a kid that's in public school. Well, say that kid in public school, like they just like the teacher's just bad, like they don't want to hear how to. We go like one of us go and like we try to communicate it though. 9 times out of 10, that kid's gonna be like, I don't want to hear it. Like,
No, here, like, yeah, maybe my amen was a little too personal, individual, I guess I should say.
Right.
That's why the amen was more towards Krystin ideas like, hey, we have this thing J-term. Like, we go help other folks in other countries. Why not help other folks across town? That's what, yeah, no, forgive me. The amen was so individualized that it was like, I'm not expecting TJ to roll up on a school and say, all right, I'm here to help. Who can I help? Like this is obviously a group effort, but you're right. The mindset is what
I wasn't saying like you wrong.
No, I hear you. No, I needed to clarify. That was my fault. Yes, ma'am.
No, great presentation.
I agree.
All right, cool. Very well done. Mom, Dad, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for having us.
Yes, absolutely. Did you have any feedback or questions for Krystin? Sorry.
Good job, Krystin. And remember, positive exposures leads to a change in mindset most times. So exposing kids with intellect or high academic expectations and standards, that can impact students. So don't think that even one encounter can change the life of a student from an unfortunate background. These kids are most times a victim of their circumstances and they can't help the situations that they're in. But as Christians, our goal should be to impact them in a way that lasts a lifetime and can possibly help them to become a productive citizen in some shape, form, or fashion at some point. So
well said.
Exposure does matter.
Well said. Thank you so much
for that.
For
10 minutes, so it matters.
Well said. Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm. I think Papa McDowell have a question.
I don't think he does.
I think he does.
He's talking.
Yeah, he's not muted. Father?
Hey, you did a great job.
Thanks. Love you guys. See you later.
Y'all have a great day.
Seems like she's trying to push y'all off.
She is.
Thank you so much. Thank you for joining us. I really appreciate y'all coming.
Thank you for having us.
right, go and get back feedback, please. Go and get your computers out. Get some feedback quickly. Make sure to submit the assignment to my SES.
That's a birthday.
Thank you.
I know.
That's awesome.